Hi everybody. I thought I'd do something a bit different today. Instead of giving you the usual report on the last Rangers game, I thought I'd give you a little history lesson. No, don't switch off. Not that kind of history lesson, thankfully. I just thought I'd give you some memories of mine from Ibrox Stadium when I started going in 1960. The painting you can see in front of you, as it shows, was actually set in 1972, but this look of the ground probably started about 1967 because the roof over the Copeland Road end, the Rangers end as we called it, came about. I think it was 1967 for the beginning of the 67-68 season. Um, that's the only difference between when I started going and this particular date. Although having said that, when I started going in 1960, the terracing was just ash and cinder. It wasn't concreted the way you can see in this painting. It was just ash and timber and kind of wooden stepping. So very primitive. But in fact, when Rangers concreted the terracing, 1962, I think it was, 63. I think we were the first club, certainly in Scotland, if not Britain, to actually do that. Everybody else still had the primitive ash and cinder set up, even Hampden and certainly Celtic Park, which was always a dump compared to us. They had the same system as well. So apart from the concreting and that roof over the Rangers end, this is what Ibrox was like when I started going in 1960. You can see the old primary school building still there behind the main stand. You can see the pitch, which isn't AstroTurf because that hadn't been invented then. It's the old horrible blaze surface. And you can see the gates, the famous blue gates to the left of the main stand on Emerson Drive. So that's basically what it looked like when I was young going. And you can see certain changes because when I started going, the floodlights were underneath each roof opposite the main stand and the main stand itself. And from this, you can see by this time, the new floodlights were erected on the roof of either side. And these floodlights, I remember being told at the time, they were the most powerful ones in Europe, the latest design, because they had to be powerful to accommodate TV, broadcasting more and more live games, or just games in the evening when you needed strong floodlights for especially the colour TV pictures that were being beamed out by that time. So apart from that, that's how it looked, say in the late 60s into the 70s. You can see where I used to go opposite the main stand, you've got the original shed, which is a kind of barrel roofed construction there. And what they did was they built around it. So if you look where the floodlights are, for instance, you can see the bit they added, which is what it was like when I started going. And that's where I always stood. Under that particular roof opposite the main stand. Occasionally, once this was the design, I would maybe stand underneath the roof at the Copeland Road end. But basically, most of my watching of the Jers has been from that side under the shed, as we called it. Sometimes we'd go opposite in the main stand, and in these days you didn't need tickets, or season tickets, you just paid. And I would say the early 80s, 1980 onwards, my dad and I and my cousin sometimes, we would just queue up, go very early, get into the main stand, and if you were lucky, you could actually get a seat right behind the director's box. You were leaning on the wooden partition between the ordinary fans and the directors. So you were sitting basically behind the directors or injured players or guests or whoever, and enjoying the same view as these VIPs. So as long as you got there early, you could do that. So that was great. But as soon as the Govan Stand, as it became, was built, that's where we moved to across there. So we sat rear Govan, halfway up maybe, on the halfway line or near the halfway line if we could get it. And that's before a season ticket became a necessity, and then when they did become a necessity, we had to move slightly to the left of the halfway line. But since 2010, 2012, I've been right on the halfway line, halfway up the back in the Sandy Jardin, as it now is. So I've basically watched all my Rangers games for 60 odd years from the same position. Talk about a creature of habit. Of course, when I was young, we would sometimes end up in the Celtic end, the Broomloan Road terracing, which you can see there on the right. And in fact, the good thing about the stadium in these days, in the early 60s into the 70s, was that you could actually start watching the game from the Copeland Road end if Rangers were shooting towards that goal, and then at half time you just walked round the entire stadium to the other end and took up position at the Broomloan Road end to see Rangers shooting into that goal. So that was great that you could actually move about. Depending on the crowd, of course. If it was jam-packed, you couldn't just easily walk between the crowds, or you could go underneath and walk round without going through the actual crowd on the terracing. But that was stopped when the shed, as we called it, was turned into the Centenary Stand in 1973. And it was 1973 because way back then, even the experts thought that was the centenary of the club's foundation. They thought it was 1873 instead of 1872. And the big disappointment about the Centenary Stand was it was really cheaply done. It was just benches with painted marks and numbers showing the seats, and you didn't need a ticket, you just paid in. You could either pay in directly or pay in to the terracing, and if it started to rain you could have thought, well, I'll just go into the Centenary Stand. You paid a bit extra, the turnstiles inside the actual stadium, to be able to transfer from the terracing to the Centenary Stand. It was still a great view, obviously, but it was just wooden benches done on the cheap. And eventually, of course, that became the Govan Stand, now the Sandy Jardin Stand. So as I say, I spent most of my Rangers watching life on that side of the pitch, near the halfway line, if I could get anywhere near there, to have the best view probably in the stadium. And obviously from early days until now, I've been in every part of Ibrox Stadium, both terracings, both stands, the North Stand, which is now the Sandy Jardin, the main stand, the club deck, the wee enclosure, as we called it. So I know what the view's like from all parts of the stadium, and I think I've got the best view halfway up the rear of the Sandy Jardin stand. Absolutely brilliant view. If you look at the painting again, you can see the tunnel and the dugouts as they were, the wee enclosure, which I went to when I was really young, when I was maybe 10 or 11, reserve games. We would go in there and watch the likes of Willie Henderson before he made it into the first team. So the wee enclosure, not a great view, but it was good when it was a reserve game. You were close to the players, you felt. You can see the roof of the stand with the press box. Obviously that had to go when they built the club deck, and obviously the main stand exterior is a B-listed building, so they couldn't change the frontage of the stand. So they did a great job, I must say, designing the club deck to just go on top of what you can see there, and keeping the wonderful facade of the main stand admired by everybody. So you've still got the historical aspect. I think the main stand was opened in 1929, so we're nearly getting to 100 years. And when that was opened, when that was designed by Archie Leach way back then, and then when it was opened, it was considered the finest football stand in Britain, not just this country, but Britain. 10,000 seats. The wee enclosure in front of it adding another 15,000, I think it was in these days. So it was luxurious. I mean, it really was something spectacular. And I think Archibald Leach, or maybe it was Bill Struth, said at the time, this stand will be a monument for 100 years or more. And sure enough, nearly 100 years later, it's still in immaculate condition. Obviously, there's been interior improvements, and you've got the club deck and top, but I don't think there's anything to rival walking up and looking at the front of the main stand, especially in the evening when it's lit up by the floodlights, which were there even when I was a youngster. So you can see that's what it used to look like. Plenty of exits, plenty of walkways inside the stadium's ground, but out with the terracing. If you look closely at the bottom there, you can see pathways that took you up from the turnstiles up to the steps into the terracing, or in the bottom centre of the painting, the north stand, the shed as we called it. That's how you got in there. But I always have fond memories of that stadium, and I've got more fond memories since then, obviously, with all the things we've won. So I think to have that just reminds me of my youth, and especially the first great Rangers team I ever saw. Richie Shearer Caldow, Greg McKinnon Baxter, Henderson, McMillan, Miller, Brand and Wilson. Happy days.